Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's Classical Wisdom event. We've got a really exciting one for you on Plato and the Tyrant. My name is Anya Leonard. I'm the founder and director of Classical Wisdom, a site dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. And to that end, we explore, the entire world of the classics, the history, the philosophy, the literature. And this one's going to be really exciting because it is really interesting part of history, but also bringing in the philosophy. And so it's kind of like a wonderful juxtaposition between seeing theory and practice. And I'm really excited to welcome our two speakers. We have James Romm. He's the James H. Ottaway Jr. Professor of Classics at Bard College and specializes in ancient Greek and Roman culture and civilization. His reviews and essays have appeared in the New Yorker, the Wall Street Journal, the London Review of Books. Dr. Romm is author of several books, including Dying Every Day, Seneca at the Court of Nero, Ghost on the Throne, The Death of Alexander the Great, The Sacred Band, 300 Theban Lovers Fighting to Save Greek Freedom, and most recently, Plato and the Tyrant, The Fall of Greece's Greatest Dynasty and the Making of a Philosophic Masterpiece, which has just come out. So it's very exciting that we're getting to talk about it in its week of publication. And also joining us, which is very exciting, is Daniel Mendelsohn, the Charles Ramlett Flint Professor of Humanities at Bard College, the editor-at-large at the New York Review of Books, and the director of the Robert B. Silvers Foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to supporting writers of nonfiction. Mendelsohn is an author of several books as well. We've got very prolific guests today, including New York Times bestseller and international bestseller, The Lost, A Search for 6 of 6 Million, and An Odyssey, A Father and Son, the Epic, and very excitingly as well, his newest translation, the newest translation of Homer's The Odyssey, was just published by the University of Chicago Press, which is excellent. Everybody's been talking about it. Us in the classics world are always thrilled to get a new and exciting translation. So thank you, Daniel, for joining us and contributing to the great space that is the classics, as well as James, your excellent book that we'll be talking about today. Just to give everybody a little rundown, we're going to do things a little differently. Very exciting. Daniel is going to be discussing this with James, and it's very fortunate because I am currently in a taverna because I don't have any internet. So I'm going to bow out before it gets too noisy and let these two brilliant men talk and discuss. But we will be collecting questions, which you can put in the chat, and we will address them near the end. But in the meantime, I'm going to turn it over to Daniel and let you guys enjoy the conversation.
Great. Thank you, Anya. It's really a great pleasure for me to be talking, Jamie, to you about this new book. Jamie is a dear friend as well as a colleague, and I've been reading, I think, everything that he's ever written since his dissertation was published. And so I think the obvious way to get, and I am filled with questions, this is a really remarkable book on a number of levels. First of all, it takes an episode that classicists might be familiar with, but by no means all classicists. And as Anya mentioned, it I think partakes equally of a political story or a historical event and a great, one of the greatest of all philosophical questions as well, and twines them together with narrative, great narrative power. I mean, one hates to use the cliche, but it really is a page turner, which is not true of every book about Plato that I've ever come across. So I guess, Jamie, the way to get started for the sake of the audience is the title of the book is Plato and the Tyrant. And I think, as a way of just sort of laying out what the basic story is, why don't you talk a little bit about who these two people are, or well, actually it's more than two, but who's Plato, who's the tyrant, and what is the sequence of events that brought Plato, whom I think we all know about in a certain way, into the muddy maelstrom of actual politics and history in the way that unfold, in the way that you unfold in the book. What's the basic story here?
Okay. So let me thank Anya and classical wisdom, and you, Daniel. You're in the middle of a very busy book tour yourself, and making the world known, letting the world know about this marvelous translation. So I really appreciate your being here. Um, the title could really have been Plato and the Tyrants, plural,
Right.
because there's two tyrants, but one is much more prominent than the other. So in the time of Plato's adult life, starting around 400 BC, when Plato was about 25, 28, um, Syracuse, which had been a democracy, so we're talking about the city in Sicily, a Greek city in the part of Sicily that was Greek colonized. Syracuse was really the superpower of the Greek world under the sway of an autocrat who had seized power, who transformed a democracy into an autocracy right around 400 BC. His name was Dionysius, and he named his son Dionysius, unfortunately for me. So we have to call them Dionysius the Elder and Dionysius the Younger. And together their reigns spanned a period of about 40 years. And those 40 years roughly correspond to the years in which Plato was the most active. He was at his peak and was writing the Republic, as I argue, all through that time because he worked on it for decades. It was his magnum opus. He wanted it to reflect all of his central ideas. So he kept revising it and improving it over the course of decades. And so I'm juxtaposing, as you say, or braiding together in the book the reign of these two tyrants, these two autocrats in Syracuse, and Plato's composition of his masterwork. Because Plato was going to Syracuse all during this time and visiting with these two tyrants, once with the father and twice with the son.
Son. So I think this audience in particular is likely to be familiar, certainly with the Republic. You begin the book by quickly sketching the importance of the Republican as a foundational document of European civilization, its importance, its continued importance in Western Civ classes, world culture classes. We both teach at Bard, where the Republic was for a very long time on the great books syllabus, as it is in other places. So, and I think people know about the Republic as a template, a sort of a fantasy template for the ideal state. But and you mentioned that Plato is working on this, refining it all through the same period he's in Syracuse. So what brings him to Syracuse? How does he get involved first with Dionysius the First, and then more disastrously with Dionysius the Second? And so if you could sketch for us sort of what the sequence of events is that brings him there, and maybe talk a little more. I think even people familiar with classics don't understand the role of Syracuse in early fourth century, how important it actually was, what the sort of global geopolitics were that made this such an important place to be at a certain moment, and what was it that brought Plato there, and what were some of the ramifications of his getting involved with these two not particularly pleasant Sicilians.
Okay, so so we're talking about 400, the early fourth century BC, 400 and later. And some of our listeners know this was right after the Peloponnesian War, the war between Athens and Sparta. So Athens and Sparta had damaged each other badly and diminished each other's power, and mainland Greece was a mess.
Right.
And the Greek West, as I call it, Sicily and southern Italy, were still undamaged. They were thriving and prosperous and had become more powerful, especially Syracuse, had become more powerful than the mainland Greek states. And the tyranny of Dionysius that started around 400
Mm.
vastly increased the power and wealth of Syracuse. So Plato arrives there about 388, about 12 years into Dionysius's reign, and it was his first time outside of Athens or outside of the near vicinity of Athens, as far as we know. And it's not clear exactly what brought him there. And he obscures his motives in his letters, I think deliberately, because he recognized by the time he wrote them that it had been a terrible mistake to go to Sicily.
Yeah.
Um, because of the events that transpired later. But there's at least one piece of evidence that he was invited there by a man named Dion. So Dion is another principal character in my
Okay.
story. He's the brother-in-law of the ruler. He married the ruler's sister, and or rather, his sister married Dionysius, and
Right.
um, the um, the regime had come to rely on him as a principal statesman, as one of its leading statesmen. And Dion and Plato formed a very tight bond, which I argue was actually a bond of romantic love. And it seems to have been Dion who brought Plato to Syracuse as a kind of
Yeah.
ally.
Yeah. And so talk a little bit more about the cast of characters. Dionysius, I always have a soft spot for Dionysius the First, even though he's an absolute horror because of his attempts at his literary aspirations. Um, but and I'm glad you brought up Dion. So the book essentially, traces Plato's interactions with a place and these figures, the first Dionysius, but really much more the second, and Dion. Now, I should admit to the listeners, the audience, that I first knew about all of this through a wonderful novel of Mary Renault, the historical novelist, called The Mask of Apollo, in which he invents a character, an Athenian actor, who becomes a sort of go-between among these various parties. And I mention that because it's going to bring us to an actually a pertinent question about what we know about the cast of characters and how we know about them. So in Renault's book, Dion is a kind of hero, a tragic hero who has grand philosophical aspirations. He's a student of Plato. He's a member of the academy, and he's desperate to sort of, as it were, bring enlightenment to this corrupt autocracy. But if you would talk a little bit more about what we know about, particularly the two Dionysiuses, um, and you have a very interesting discussion of the sources for what we know about them and why it's problematic to sort of make assumptions about who these men were because of the nature of our sources. So can you get a little bit into the personalities and how we know about them? Aside
Sure.
from aside from Plato, I'm going to deal with the letters in a different question.
Yeah, that's a big question. Um, so the two Dionysii, father and son, elder and younger, were very different personalities, as is usually true in these dynastic tyrannies, because the son is brought up under the sway of this towering patriarch, and they usually don't turn out very good. You know, it's rare that you get a son who is nearly as charismatic or confident as the father. And that was especially true in this case. Dionysius the First, who founded the tyranny, was a larger than life figure. He wrote tragedies, he led military campaigns, he was a warrior, he was a chieftain, and he held these magnificent banquets at which luminaries would wine and dine with him. Um, his son had been kept, apparently had been kept kind of in seclusion during childhood. Dionysius the elder didn't seem to have taken to him or was mistrustful of him, maybe, and didn't give him an education, didn't allow him to grow up. And so when he came to power at age 30, after the death of his father, he was very insecure, unstable in rule, but also had philosophic leanings. He knew that he lacked education and that he could improve himself. by talking with a philosopher. And so he invited Plato in for a second visit and later for a third visit and tried desperately to get Plato to become his mentor.
Right.
Yeah. So the sources, we can talk more about the letters of Plato, but the history of Diodorus Siculus, who was a Sicilian himself, as his name implies, has a lot of information. The Life of Dion by Plutarch has a lot of information, and various scattered bits in anthologists like Athenaeus and people like that. Um,
Mhm.
but um, but nothing compares with Plato's letters, so we can talk about them when you're ready. But that is my principal source for the Dionysi.
Right. But as you discussed, what I was thinking about was, you have a very complicated job to do in this book because you're telling a story about history, about characters, and particularly Dionysius the First, maybe even more than the younger, about whom contemporary historians had very strong feelings depending on their own allegiances. So I think you mentioned on the one hand, Timaeus was a source, right, for Dionysius, who was very anti. He was anti against the monarchy, but there's a more, I can't remember his name. Who's the one who was a sort of more? He was an aristocrat, more pro. Uh, I'm blank.
Phyllis,
Yeah. So that and the sources that we do have were reliant on these, more or less contemporary sources. So I think it's always a danger to sort of make too many assumptions about who these people were because all of our sources were partial, although a picture does emerge. So particularly in the second and third Plato's visits, and of course we think we know a lot about Plato because we have his writings, although as you also explain in the book, those are also problematic. So, for example, you talked about, and I thought this was very interesting in the book about the sort of, as it were, ancient gossip about the relationship between Plato and Dion, because I think Dion is a very important character in all of this, and certainly was a stronger personality than Dionysius the Younger, who was, one of those sort of sad Louis the XVI types who just could have had a nice career as a plumber or something if he didn't have to be running Syracuse. Um, so that's, I think, is a good example, the famous poem about Dion, right? So maybe talk a little bit about that and the way scholars can disagree about how we read what seem to be self-evident texts and how problematic they are.
yeah, yeah. So the relationship between Plato and Dion is really at the heart of my story because it's the spark that set the fire that burned Syracuse to the ground. It's the wedge that drove the two sides of the royal family apart. And I present evidence that it was really an erotic bond. And when we talk about Platonic eros, sexual desire, we have to remember that he preached a doctrine in which eros didn't have to be physically sexual. It could be mental and spiritual and still called eros. So
Mhm.
you can't say, they went to bed together definitively, but Plato does have a poem or poem that's attributed to Plato that says in its final line, Dion, you drove my soul mad with eros. And the poem is subject to controversy, as several of Plato's writings are. There are people who say it can't be by Plato. And the reason that they bring for challenging it is that this relationship was impossible. They couldn't have maintained eros over the course of the decades that the poem, at the point the poem was written, it had been decades since they met. What kind of reasoning is that? We all know of love affairs that go on for decades, even when two people are not together. So
Mm.
I think there's a deep bias against the authenticity of the poem. I think it's authentic. There's every reason to think it's authentic, and that it tells us a lot about this relationship.
And so that's a good entree into. I want to do two things now. So, because some of the central evidence about what went on in Syracuse, what Plato's ambitions were, what actually unfolded, are these famous letters, these Platonic letters, some of which deal directly with his involvement in Syracuse. So I want Jamie first, if you could just sketch for the audience what did go down, like what happened with particularly Dionysius the Second, the younger, why it was such a disaster, and then talk about the letters because I think, here again, there are arguments about the evidence, and a lot of the reasoning about the authenticity of the letters is quite circular. Basically people say, well, Plato could never have written a letter like this because he's not being a noble philosopher in these letters. He's just a guy who's struggling with a disastrous situation. So, but I think first, if you could just quickly sort of say what happened when the
Mhm.
great philosopher went and tried to, as it ostensibly, I mean, this is the sort of elevator pitch, make a philosopher king out of this poor guy, Dionysius the younger, and
Mhm.
then talk a little bit about what evidence is present in the letters and why there has been a controversy about the usefulness of the letters as evidence for your story.
Okay. Those are two big questions, but
Two big
I'll take them,
questions,
yeah,
but
I'll
we've
take them
got
one at a
plenty of
time.
time.
Okay. So, so the court of Dionysius the Younger was riven by factionalism, as all autocratic courts are, right? Um, People wanting to be on the good side of the ruler and cast other people out as enemies. Dion, who was older by the ruler by more than a decade and much more talented as a statesman, was mistrusted by the what I call the hardliners, people who supported the autocrat and wanted to be on his good side. When Plato arrived, at the invitation of both Dion and Dionysius the Younger, they both wanted him in. Um, he and Dion were clearly, on the same wavelength. They were a pair, and their closeness created a sense of paranoia that maybe they were plotting to overthrow the tyrant, take his place. I actually leave open the question that that may have been true. There may have been some truth to it, that
Mm.
Plato may have seen Dion as a more effective ruler and a more philosophic one, and had some role in putting him in power, as he later did take power. But that,
Because if I may interrupt, I mean,
yeah,
one reason in favor of the, as it were, the romantic interpretation is it seems to me that if they do have I mean, whatever the relationship was, and Plato knows this guy as an apt pupil, he's a talented young guy. I mean, it's not impossible to think that he thinks this is the person you want to slip into the top job. And if he can help,
exactly.
he wants to do that. Go on.
Exactly. So, so the court becomes very suspicious of Dion and whispers all kinds of rumors in the ruler's ear. This guy's out to get you. He's out to overthrow you, and he's conspiring with Plato. Finally, Dionysius acted to banish Dion from Syracuse. He found a pretext and kicked him out. And Plato was stuck there, right, without his sidekick, and forced to more or less become a prisoner, as almost under house
Yeah.
arrest. Um, this touched off, as I say, this drove a wedge between these two sides of the royal family. Dionysius the elder had married two wives. The genealogical chart is there in the book, and you can follow it easier if you have the chart. But he married two wives at the same time, consummated the unions on the same night, so that it wouldn't be clear which one conceived first, right? Because he wanted to keep that sort of secret. In fact, Dionysius is the mother of the ruler was the first to conceive. Dion came from the other side, the other wife. He was the brother of the other wife.
The other one.
So there were two halves of the family, and then now they're starting to split apart. And eventually the split becomes so wide that it really becomes a civil war.
Right, right. And so where do the letters come in, and what's the issue about the letters? I chuckled to myself when I was reading the beginning of your introduction to the letters and how you recall that no one in, graduate school, whatever, nobody was ever, even people who were, interested in Plato, nobody was really required to look at the letters or know anything about them because nobody ever took them very seriously. But you rely on them strongly, some of them. So
Mhm.
maybe explain to people what what the controversy is and why you are actually diverging from a number of classicists and assuming that some of these are authentic. Why are they so important? Uh,
Hmm. Hmm. So there are 13 letters that come down to us among the works of Plato that were collected in the first century BC. A Greek scholar made what's called a canon, the official works of Plato,
mhm,
and there are
mhm,
13 letters in that canon. For centuries, millennia really, nobody questioned that they were by Plato. Then in the 14th century, when Italian humanists started translating Plato's works into Latin, they decided that one of these letters had to be booted out and called a fake. And the only reason that they gave is that it didn't conform to the majesty of Plato. It made him look small and shabby compared with the great philosopher that we all like to think of. So that started a process of sorting letters according to whether you accept them or reject them, and treating them differently. Um, some are more authentic than others or more trusted than others.
mm,
There is one in the batch which is clearly not by Plato. So
right.
that raises alarm, right? One bad
Is
apple.
that the first? The
The
first?
first one.
Yeah.
The first one is clearly not by Plato. So that raises, alarm bells that maybe there are other fakes in there. And we know that some letters in antiquity were faked. People forged them to sell them to libraries, make a profit.
Yeah.
And rhetoricians who were training how to write great letters, they would impersonate famous people in well-known situations. What would Plato say to Dionysius? That sort of thing. The letters have been investigated every which way from Sunday.
Right.
Every tool that scholarship can find has been used on them, and there's still no consensus, right? Nothing has been proved. And in fact, you can't prove authenticity.
Yeah.
It's impossible. You can't even prove that Plato wrote the Republic, right? What proof could there be that it was his authentic work?
Right.
So, um, so ultimately, it's a judgment call.
Yeah.
Now, I use a set of criteria that are maybe, subjective, unquantifiable, having to do with tone, voice, persona, and especially the issue of what is at stake for the letter writer. So if you understand the dynamics of the relationship between Plato and Dionysius the Younger, the letters that I use are directed to him or about him. These letters are very subtle and nuanced in the way that they deal with that relationship, both
So
in,
what I mean, so what, give us examples maybe of like what do these letters tell us about what was going on? Just
well, there's a wide range. So one letter, which is addressed by Plato to Dionysius, is very warm and chummy. They were good pals at that point.
mm, mm,
Later, they're much more combative. And after Dionysius is thrust out of power, they have a kind of defensive tone, proving that Plato was not at fault for the things that went wrong in Syracuse,
mm,
explaining his participation in a way that exculpates him. So they deal with the situation as it evolved over the course of about 10 years, and there are different strategies at different points. but all of them are extremely nuanced and subtle
Mhm.
in their rhetorical strategies. And you can posit that this is the work of a literary genius who, a psychological genius, who could really get inside this relationship and
Right,
write convincingly.
right,
That thesis can't be refuted, right? Such people do exist. But it's far more likely, in my view, that if it reads like Plato and it conforms to the historical circumstances and it comes down to us as Plato's work, it's
right.
authentic.
And as you point out, I think somewhere in the book, we now have, because of some archaeological discoveries, right, we now have a very early papyrus fragment from one of the letters, right, which suggests that this is actually a tradition that goes back quite a long time. So I think your argument's very persuasive. All right, so I want to sort of pull back a little and look at the big picture. So here is Plato, eminent philosopher, renowned Athenian, leader of the academy. He's working for decades on the Republic, which is one of the most ambitious works of political philosophy in the Western tradition, during the time that he is actually enmeshed in the uh, dirty, hands-on politics of court, the intrigues of an autocratic court. This goes on also for decades. I mean, it's a long relationship. The relationship with Dionysius the Younger outlasts his political role. And, again, back to the elevator pitch, this is about a philosopher who has a dream of a philosopher-king, that the leader of the state should be a philosopher, a person who is trained in philosophy. He tries to have some influence in an actual political setting. It blows up, as you indicated. First, the court is factionalized, then the city is factionalized. And it all goes up in flames. So the takeaway is not great,
Mhm.
right? And one could argue for political philosophy. There's a kind of an old saw that lurks behind this, which is, the one about, historians are the people who look at the past and no one pays attention to them. And the same with political philosophers, right? So I want to talk a little bit about the Republic, its relation, the work, the Republic, and its relationship to this moment in Plato's life. You begin the book with, I thought, a very kind of moving uh, uh, acknowledgement that, we at Bard who have had to teach the Republic to undergraduates, and that, when we were in college, it was sort of handed down to you like the Ten Commandments, the Republic as this great beacon of philosophical insight, and the way in which the undergraduates, particularly lately, have been very resistant to that version of the Republic. And you talk about moments when even you had a hard time persuading yourself that your defense of the Republic was authentic. So maybe talk a little. I was quite touched by that, and I certainly identified what are the problems with the Republic, so to speak, and how does that relate, as you see it, to Plato's actual involvement in politics? In other words, as opposed to sitting in the academy and theorizing, right? This is really a story about theory versus practice, if you wanted
Mhm.
to boil it down. So what are the problems of the Republic? Does the Republic, which as you yourself mentioned, reflect his experiences in Sicily? Are they meant to apologize? And so, is it, talk a little bit about that, because that is really I think the big question that readers come into this story with, what is the relationship of the philosophical treatise to the real history here, and how do they correspond?
Mhm. So it's a braid of theory and practice. I think that the parts of the Republic, well, we know that parts of the Republic preceded
Right.
Plato's first journey to Syracuse. but parts were written after his first and second journeys, and possibly even after his third. So he was theorizing while he was practicing and practicing based on his theories. So it's hard to say, exactly at any point which was first. Um, but the problems that you point to, um, you know, the philosopher king is an autocrat, and the ideal state, what's sometimes called an ideal state, it's a perfectly just state. I don't think it's ideal in any sense, but it's perfectly just according to Plato, in Socrates, Plato's spokesperson,
Hmm.
is a military dictatorship with a military class that supports the autocrat absolutely, and the autocrat has absolute power, and the population has the general population is not allowed to participate in politics at all. They're producers and consumers, and it looks very much to our minds, to our eyes, like a fascist regime. And Plato has been accused of fascism by
Mhm.
critics of the Republic. There's also a eugenic scheme, which I deal with quite candidly, that the sexual life of these military guards are to be closely regulated. They're to be bred for the ideal children, and children who don't meet up to certain standards are going to be subject to infanticide, and sexual life will be regulated by the state. Um, and the regime will decay and start to collapse when the eugenic scheme is not followed. It's vital to the survival of the state to breed the right kind of soldiers slash rulers.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
that's tough stuff. For those who've lived through, or have historical memory of the Nazis, that's tough stuff.
Right. Right. It has been one of the great, and you haven't even touched on, another famous problem with the Republic of Plato, which is his attitude towards the arts, which is just as draconian and upsetting to the modern liberal democratic sensibility, right? That art, poetry has to be abolished and drama has to be abolished and all of
Mhm.
that. So I wonder, again, to pull out a little bit, we all have had, anyone who's taught the Republic has to struggle with this. And I guess my first question is, is there anything in the Republic worth salvaging, given the bleak picture that you paint of what it is? And certainly a great critique of it at a certain point was that it looks awfully like a fascist dictatorship. And
Mm.
I just have to parenthetically say, there's the famous issue apropos of what you were saying about how it does advocate eugenics in a very bold way. And there's this famous thing called the nuptial number, which I don't
Mhm.
think anyone understands what that is. But so what do you do with the Republic and students now? And has the writing of this book, do you think it's changed how you think about the Republic as someone who has had to teach it over the years? I mean, has it given you insight into why Plato framed the Republic in the way that he did? I mean, given,
Mhm.
having seen an actual autocracy in action with very unhappy results, there's a
Mhm.
sort of paradox, right? Which is why are you still advocating an autocratic regime? So I'm just wondering if your thinking has evolved
Mhm.
during the course of researching and writing the book.
Mhm. Yeah, very much so. And by the way, I don't mean to junk the Republic or
No,
take down Plato. It is a masterpiece, and he is a, incredibly powerful thinker. And there are parts of it that are not meant to be taken literally.
right.
Uh, the eugenic scheme, well, did he really want that? Or is that like a thought experiment? It's hard to really know. But um, yeah, the fact that he had this flirtation or cozying up to an actual autocrat in an effort to enlighten a regime, to make a regime more philosophic, dovetails with the things that he says in Republic. He says, um, if we had a single king's son who was not corrupted by court life and could teach him and make him more philosophic, that would save all humankind
Mm, mm, mm.
because that would start a chain reaction of enlightenment. He thought that what was happening in Syracuse was an opening that could potentially save the whole Greek world, which he saw sliding into not chaos exactly, but he saw it deteriorating
Yeah,
around him, and which it was. I mean,
which it was.
which it was. And he thought he could stop the slide by going to this one powerful city and converting one powerful man, and it would all flow from there. So, I mean, you have to admire the ideals, even though the
Yeah,
practice
there's something almost poignant about it, right?
is very poignant. Yes, it's very
That, and
poignant.
also I think it's important for, audience to understand, and you might want to do a very quick sketch for us here, but Plato watched the disintegration of the radical Athenian democracy,
Mhm.
right? That was his youth, is watching Athens self-destruct as a radical democracy with, and the widest enfranchisement of any place anywhere at the time. Uh, and so, his fixation on the idea that a leader, an enlightened leader, was the way to go did not come out of nowhere. Um,
No, absolutely
clearly,
not.
you know,
I
my
see
fi-
Monica waving her hand. Maybe she should. No, that was not a wave of the hand.
No,
not
no,
a
I've
way
got
to,
mosquitoes. It's
Oh, mosquitoes. Okay.
you
I,
guys are good.
um, I know that there are going to be some audience questions, but I want to ask maybe as my last question before we go to audience questions. Um, You've written another book about the relationship of philosophy to power,
Mhm.
which is your wonderful book on Seneca and Nero called Dying Every Day. And so I'm just sort of interested in the relationship of these two books, which are, one could say, first cousins, one to the other. I mean, they're both about uh, failed interactions between philosophers and absolute autocrats. And I was just
Mhm.
wondering, is that, I guess the question in a sideways way is, how did you come to this topic? And did it have anything to do with the questions that you were forced to ask when dealing with Seneca and Nero? Did that sort of plant a seed in your brain in any way?
Mhm. Yeah, as you point out, they're very parallel stories. Seneca was advisor to Nero, tried to make him a more moral, ethical, constitutional ruler to
Mhm.
obey the rule of law. And that's very much what Plato was doing with Dionysius the Younger. Seneca was much more closely enmeshed because he was right there at the palace. He didn't have the luxury to go home to Athens and study in the academy when all was said and done. But yes, they're both deeply interesting to me because of the role of morality in politics. They're both about a moral man, a moral thinker, trying to influence politics and maybe having some success, but ultimately failing. And that to me is a deep tragedy. And, frankly, the failure of morality in politics is a tragic theme today in our own society. And I'm deeply aware of that.
Yeah, yeah. I had been wondering about that. I think that's a natural segue to a question that just popped up uh, in the chat. Uh, and this audience member asks, in your opinion, what would Plato's conversation with the average American citizen look like given the current state of the United States and its politics?
Hmm. Yeah, well, Plato would not be too happy about our current state of politics. Um, in the Republic, he diagnoses the reasons why democracy fails and gives rise to tyranny. And he has a very detailed analysis of how that happens, why that happens, the role of money, the role of pleasure, um, the um, uh, the rise of a populist, a charismatic demagogue, all things that we see happening around us. He diagnosed in the books 8 and 9 of the Republic. He
Right.
thought it was inevitable that democracy would give rise to tyranny because he had seen it happen too many times.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's obviously a question we're all thinking about right now, which is uh, why your book seems to have sort of landed at a particularly, I mean, a fortuitous moment for you, if not for the country, let me say. So another question is, did Plato learn from this failure late in life, particularly in the laws, which focuses more on laws and less on individual virtue as the linchpin? That's an interesting question.
Mhm. Yes. Yeah. And I do discuss the laws very briefly at the
Yeah.
end of my book. The laws puts out a constitution for what Plato calls the second best state. The best state was a republic, but by then he's really written that off as impossible. He says it's the children of gods who would live in that kind of state. But for human beings, we need a strict code of laws and following the laws as if one follows God
Mm,
is the way to live, a decent political life. So he's abandoned the loftiness, the sublimity of the republic in which he's striving to inculcate a kind of transcendent philosophic inspiration for
mm,
for governance. And he's resorted to, okay, here are the rules, and you've now just got to follow them. And I
right.
think that that was a result partly of the failure of Syracuse.
Yeah. Well, because it's also an abandonment of the idea of the leader, right?
Yeah.
That everything flows from the leader class, which clearly uh, doesn't work. That actually segues nicely into a question that just popped up. With the failings of the rule of the 30 back in Athens at the end of the Peloponnesian War, reinforced Plato's lessons learned from his time in Syracuse. So maybe just quickly explain who the 30 was and what that backstory was, and then come back to the question of whether the failure of the 30 somehow reinforced what Plato learned later on from his time in Syracuse.
So the 30 were put in power by the Spartans after the defeat of Athens in the Peloponnesian War. They were Athenians, but they were very conservative, very right wing, and they were meant to establish a new government on Spartan type principles. Instead, they seized power for themselves, became autocrats, and conducted a reign of terror, eliminating their opposition, executing democratic dissidents, and so on. And were overthrown in a very short time because they were so extreme that the democracy rebounded and fought in the streets to get them out of power and succeeded. And Plato lived through all this, and one of his close relatives, well, not close, he was a distant relative, was the leader of the 30, a man named Critias.
Really us.
And Plato was expected to join the 30 because of his family connections and his, what were perceived as his own politics, and declined to do so. And he writes in the seventh letter, which I consider genuine, that he saw this episode as invalidating tyranny as a valid approach to governance, and then the restored democracy executed Socrates only a few years later, and that
Right.
validated democracy. So he's canceled out. He's seen both possible governances canceled out, and that led him to reach for a new way, the philosopher-king.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it is an interesting. I was thinking that you really have to understand what Plato saw as a young man at the end of the war and the collapse of the Athenian democracy and the rule of the 30 and the death of Socrates and all of that start appreciating why whatever it may have meant and however seriously we're supposed to take the Republic, why he thought there had to be another way. I always think when talking about the Republic, one wishes there were a better English translation of the word politeia,
Mm.
because when we hear the word republic, we think of a kind of government that's related to democracy.
Mhm.
Polity seems to be the better translation.
Yeah,
Oh,
or use the subtitle on justice.
on just
That's really a better title for the work.
Yeah. And actually, apropos of the reign of the 30, the rule of the 30, and you talk about this in the book, but the Republic begins with Socrates going down to Piraeus, and Piraeus was the seat of the democratic resistance. So it's already, there's already a kind of loaded political resonance, even at the very beginning, the idea that these people are going down to Piraeus, which I think must have resonated for the original audience very, very strongly, especially if one knew Plato's history.
And
Um,
the house in which the
yeah,
conversation takes place is owned by victims of the tyranny, who
uh,
one of whom was killed and another was exiled and stripped of his property.
yeah.
And that is clearly intentional.
Yeah, absolutely. So the proscriptions of the 30 would have really been very much in people's minds and framing, the way the dialogue begins. Two interesting questions here. This is news to me, but maybe not to you. If nobody has asked so far, what Romm's opinion on the Swedish classicist Gunnar Rudberg's idea from 1917 that Plato's Atlantis story is reflecting the situation in Syracuse, a powerful island, the king's palace on a small island, and also the lessons from the Republic reflected in the Atlantis story.
Hmm.
I confess I'm not familiar with this, but maybe you are.
Actually, I'm not. But I do discuss the Atlantis, the Critias, which has the Atlantis story
Mhm.
in one of my chapters. And it's among the people who are listening to the Critias, the participants in the dialogue, is a famous Syracusan by the name of Hermocrates.
Right,
And it seems clear that Plato intended to write a dialogue called Hermocrates in which he would become the principal speaker,
right,
but never did. And he never finished the Critias either.
right,
And so there is a link to Syracuse. And I think the link has to do with the fact that Atlantis had a kind of a golden age, was a kind of utopian world, and fell off and was destroyed because of its racial impurity, because the ruling class became adulterated with human genes,
Hmm,
where they were mostly divine at the beginning. They were half divine at the beginning.
right. Hmm,
Syracuse, which would have come next under in the dialogue Hermocrates, had fallen off in other ways and had experienced its destruction at the time
hmm,
that it was writing. So
hmm.
that are in parallel. I wouldn't say that Atlantis itself reflects Syracuse. It's much closer to Athens, really, but um, there is a Syracusan link in the fact that Hermocrates is present.
Right. Very interesting. All kinds of interesting things come out of Scandi classicists, I find. I remember once having read a book about how all of the Odyssey actually was about Scandinavia.
Right.
Um,
Yes, and our former colleague Bill Mullen was very interested in that thesis.
Yes, and that Odysseus is actually becomes Odin, king of the gods. So who knew?
Oh,
And a final question was a good one. What's the actual evidence that the Republic was written in part after the first trip to Syracuse? Because it's usually placed between the first and second voyages of Plato to Sicily.
mm, mm. So we know that part of it was in circulation before 388 because it's parodied in a play by Aristophanes that was written in the 390s. So there
Right.
was some portion of it already in circulation by that time, but much of the style and certain verbal usages seem to be later in time. And some of them are very late if one compares with the Laws, which is known to be his last work.
Right. Right.
So people who do stylometry, stylistic analysis, have found these layers and seams and determined that, and I discuss this in the book, determined that it was composed over a long period of time.
And isn't it the case? I was fascinated by this, and I must say I didn't know anything about it, that there are certain Sicilian locutions
Mhm.
that make their way. And can you talk about that a little bit? I thought that was very interesting.
Mhm. So occasionally in the Republic or in many of Plato's dialogues, when someone asks, you know, what's that or what now, they use an emphatic expression, "ti main" in Greek, and apparently this was a locution that was only used in Sicily at this time.
Hmm,
It's
hmm,
not found in any other contemporary Attic
hmm.
writers. It is found in Sicilian writers, and you can you can find books of the Republic where it does not occur and other books where it does.
Wow.
And so this is not my thesis. This has already been published by other people that it seems as if the parts that contain T main were written after at least the first voyage, if not the second, when Plato heard this jaunty expression and said, "Hey, I'll put that to use." That sounds like, that's a fun thing to write.
Yeah, very interesting. As we're both translators, the first thing that occurred to me is like, how would you translate it so it sounded a little regional, you know? But yeah, good questions. And I think by the reappearance of Anya from her taverna on the island of Syros, that we have to bring the question part to an end.
Well, I'm happy to report that the local inebriated French tourists have departed, so I can re-enter at least temporarily to just wrap up things because I know that both of you have a very busy schedule, and I'm really grateful that you've been able to take the time out to join our audience. And James, it was so interesting to hear like more in depth this really fascinating part of history, to see the relationship of theory versus practice. And I feel like people are going to want to be less interested in the Republic afterwards a little
I
bit.
don't, no, I don't want that to happen. I,
No.
I mean, if anything, it's a more compelling work because of its biographical context. I mean, to me, reading things with some notion of the author's life is always more gratifying. So I hope that's true in this case.
I think so. I think honestly as well. I mean, when we're trying to learn from the ancient world, we don't just want what worked. We want to see at times what didn't work. And that's just as valuable of a lesson. And one of the big takeaways we always try to have here at Classical Wisdom is trying to see the relevance of these ancient works in our modern day and our here and now, and say, okay, we're regularly having a conversation like, what should our relationship be with politics, like as a society? How should our relationship be? And to see sometimes, okay, you have a tyrant, and you're also offering eugenics. Like, how is that not going to work out? Maybe it's good to see the whole breadth of his philosophy and its evolution to sort of take away um, more relevant or relatable
Yeah.
ideas of how we're supposed to live now.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
But I also want to say thank you, Daniel, so much for your questions. I was getting questions in from the audience as well, being like, "Oh, Daniel's so good. He's asking a question like as I'm typing it." So I really appreciate that your insights as well from looking at this really fascinating story.
My
And
pleasure.
I want to thank also the audience for as always taking part. You know, we've got a really international crowd, so I know there's a lot of people who will be watching this in the recording from whatever corner of the earth they're watching from. And so I just love that we've got a great community of people who really take this topic to heart as something that is important to discuss. You
Yeah.
guys are awesome. This is really fascinating. I was riveted, and I can tell everybody else was
This
too.
book,
And the Odyssey too.
it's a gripping read. I know some of the stuff we've been talking about is abstract and philosophical, but the story is so compelling and the writing is absolutely, it's a page turner. It's just the personalities are so great. Do order it. It's really wonderful.
And while you're on the ordering site, get a copy of Daniel's Odyssey.
Two for the price of two.
Yeah, we should do a package deal. Yeah.
Well, I will be sending out an email following up on this with links to both because I do genuinely think they're excellent books, and I'm really excited to tell everyone about it. And I want to thank everybody again. It's past 10 o'clock at night. I think the tavern is going to be closing on me pretty soon, so I'm going to have to make my way through the mosquitoes to find her.
Thank
Try
you,
to look
Anya.
back.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Thank you, everyone. And thank you also to Sean for helping out from the back
Thank
end.
you,
I really
Sean.
appreciate it. And everybody have a wonderful, wonderful week.
Thanks.